It's a simple situation that almost everyone has faced. A friend or even a close family member approaches you and says, "Can you lend me some money, please?" In that moment, a sense of tension immediately builds inside. On one hand, it feels awkward to refuse, as it seems like an act of cruelty or indifference. On the other hand, you feel you're not ready, you don't want to, or you simply aren't able to part with your money. In these seconds, most people make the same mistake. They start to justify themselves, going into detailed accounts of their finances and revealing personal information. But any justification sounds like weakness. The other person might think, "Okay, not now, but I'll still be able to ask again later." And then the requests will keep coming. Why is the word no so hard to say? From childhood, we were taught to be agreeable. We were told to share, agree, don't refuse. This ingrained the feeling that saying no is bad. As adults, we're afraid to say no because it brings up a feeling of guilt. But in reality, guilt is just a habit. We think that by refusing, we're leaving someone without help. But the truth is, everyone has their own life, and everyone is responsible for their own decisions. Your refusal doesn't ruin someone else's destiny. On the contrary, it can help them take responsibility for themselves. A common mistake is trying to justify yourself. Imagine someone asks for money and you start listing things off. "I have a mortgage, kids, expenses. I can't." It all sounds logical, but you've revealed too much information. Now the other person knows your struggles and might use that knowledge in the future. It's much wiser to simply and clearly say, "No, I can't," and stop there. In Tibetan wisdom, there's a saying, "A short word cleanses the heart." A simple phrase without excuses immediately sets a boundary. Sometimes people go to the other extreme and answer harshly. A person who is tired of constantly lending money might snap, "That's enough, stop asking me for money." A boundary is set, but with it comes a conflict that can destroy the relationship. Aggression always comes from weakness. It shows that you've tolerated and accumulated resentment for a long time and finally exploded. A wise person, however, speaks calmly, in a timely manner, and without unnecessary emotion. It's important to understand that no isn't greed or coldness. No is an indicator of inner strength. A person who knows how to refuse commands more respect than someone who always agrees, even when it's difficult for them. People sense the truth. And even if someone is offended in the moment, over time, their respect for you will grow. The Tibetan tradition often repeats, "He who cannot say no cannot say yes either." If you give out of guilt, your yes isn't real, it's empty. But if you can refuse, it means you are free. And then, when you say yes, it will be sincere, from the heart. Imagine a monk to whom people come every day with requests. "Help, give me your time, give me advice." If he agreed to everything, he would quickly burn out and couldn't help anyone. But a wise mentor knows that to preserve their strength, they must refuse, calmly, respectfully, but firmly. It's the same in our lives. If you always agree, you lose energy and respect. If you can refuse, you preserve yourself and your ability to help when it's truly possible and necessary. So the ability to say no is a skill of a mature person. You don't need to justify yourself. You don't need to reveal your finances. And you don't need to get aggressive. It's enough to speak calmly, briefly, and clearly. This is the beginning of the path to inner freedom. In the next part, we'll examine why people ask for money in the first place and how not to fall into the trap of guilt. When we're faced with a request to lend money, it seems like just a specific random situation. But behind it, there's always a psychology, both of the person asking and the person refusing. To learn to say no calmly and confidently, you need to understand why people turn to us and what happens inside us when we hear those words. A person doesn't just ask for a loan because they're out of money. More often than not, it's due to a habit of shifting responsibility. It's easier to ask a friend than to find a solution yourself, change your lifestyle, or deal with the consequences of your own decisions. For some, it's a survival strategy. For others, it's a convenience. But if you look deeper, you can notice that a request for a loan often isn't about poverty, but about an internal belief that someone else should help. On the other hand, the person being asked immediately experiences a mix of feelings: pity, obligation, fear of refusal. And it's almost always accompanied by a feeling of guilt. Guilt is the main tool many people use to get their way. It works subtly. You feel like if you don't give the money, you're doing something wrong. But in reality, You're just refusing to get involved in someone else's situation. And here it's important to remember a simple truth. Refusal isn't betrayal, it's a way to maintain balance. If you always say yes, you'll get pulled into someone else's problems. But if you calmly say no, you help the other person face their reality. Perhaps this will motivate them to seek real solutions, not temporary handouts. Tibetan wisdom teaches that there are different ways to help. Sometimes the best help is not to give what is asked for, but to prevent them from becoming even more dependent. Many people are afraid that refusal will ruin a relationship. But let's be honest. If your relationship only holds because you regularly lend money, it's not a true connection. Real respect is built on honesty and sincerity. A person may be offended by your no, but with time, they'll understand that you were honest. And it's this honesty that creates a strong foundation for a relationship. Your inner state plays a crucial role here. When you refuse with irritation or contempt, you truly hurt the other person. But if your no is spoken calmly, without judgment, it sounds like a natural boundary. You're not judging the person or devaluing their problems. You're simply and honestly stating your position. And then even a refusal carries respect. To feel this, try a little mental exercise. Remember a time when someone refused you, but did so calmly and confidently. You probably left with a sense of respect. Now remember a refusal given with irritation or rudeness. The difference is obvious. It's not about the words, but the energy with which they are spoken. There are simple phrases that help you refuse gently. For example, I can't help you in this particular way, or I'm not able to lend money, but I wish you find a solution. Or even simpler, I can't right now. These words are short, without aggression or excuses. They immediately set a boundary and leave no room for unnecessary questions. Many people make the mistake of sharing details of their lives, explaining why they can't lend. But the more details you reveal, the more entangled you become in your own words. By speaking simply and clearly, you maintain your dignity and don't destroy trust. A story from my practice shows how this approach works. One man admitted that he used to always agree to lend money to friends. He ended up in debt himself, and his relationships with those he helped still fell apart. When he learned to refuse briefly and calmly, it was difficult at first. But then he noticed that his true friends stayed, while those who only valued his wallet disappeared. As a result, his life became calmer and clearer. This is the power of a simple no. It doesn't destroy if it's spoken with respect. It frees both you and the person asking, you from unnecessary responsibility and them from the illusion that someone will always come to their rescue. So you shouldn't be afraid to refuse. The only thing to fear is losing yourself by constantly pleasing others. Real care begins with honesty. And if you want to be helpful, learn to say no so that your voice sounds calm and kind. Then refusal becomes not a cold wall, but a gentle boundary that strengthens relationships. In the next part, we'll talk about how to prepare yourself for such a conversation, what internal practices help you stay calm, and how to deliver a refusal so that it feels strong and respectful. Once we understand that a refusal isn't a betrayal, but a way to maintain honesty and inner balance, the next question arises. How do you prepare yourself for the conversation? In theory, it's simple. Say no briefly and calmly. But in practice, anxiety builds inside. What if they get offended? What if I seem greedy? What if the relationship is ruined? This is why it's so important to prepare your internal state beforehand. Before you speak to the person, try to pause for a few seconds. Take 3 deep breaths. But not to relax and escape the situation. Do it to gather energy within yourself. Inhale confidence. Exhale fear. This is a small practice that takes less than a minute, but it changes your tone. It's one thing to speak when you're tense, and quite another when you have inner support and clarity. The wisdom of Tibetan practices teaches that words don't decide the outcome of a conversation. It's the state from which they are spoken that matters. Even a simple no can sound rude if you feel irritation inside, or it can sound gentle if you're calm. So first, you need to align yourself, and then you speak the words. Next, it's important to remember that a refusal is not a long speech. People often get confused precisely because they start to explain too much. When someone asks you for money, a short answer sounds stronger and more respectful than long justifications. If you say, "I can't help in this way," there's no weakness in that phrase. It doesn't invite further questions. But if you start with, "My paycheck isn't until next week, I still have to pay bills, and maybe after that," you open the door to pressure. Sometimes it's helpful to prepare a few simple phrases in advance so you don't have to search for words in a tense moment. For example, I don't have the means right now, or I can't lend money, but I wish you find a solution. These sentences are short, without details, without aggression. It's important to say them calmly and with a steady voice. Then the person will hear the boundary but won't feel attacked. A special case is when the request comes from someone very close, family, friends, colleagues you spend a lot of time with. Here, the temptation to justify yourself is especially high. It seems like you need to explain everything in detail so the person isn't offended, but it's precisely in close relationships that you need to learn honesty. If you get in the habit of making up excuses every time, you'll eventually get tangled in your own web of words. Simple clarity is always more reliable. Many people fear that a refusal will lead to conflict, but more often than not, it's the long explanations that create mistrust. The person hears, "I don't have enough money, I have difficulties," and instead of backing off, they think, "I should ask later when things get easier." This means you're just postponing the problem. But if you've said simply, "I can't," it sounds final and leaves no room for illusions. There's another important point. When you refuse, keep in mind that you have a right to your boundaries. It's your time, your energy, your resources. No one can demand what you're not ready to give, and you don't need to prove this right to anyone. It's as natural as the right to breathe. An internal awareness of this fact gives you special power. Imagine the situation. Someone comes and asks. Inside, you already feel tension. At that moment, remember, you have the right to refuse. You don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to reveal yourself. You don't have to sacrifice yourself. This knowledge instantly gives your voice calmness and firmness. Then, even a simple no sounds confident, and the other person feels that arguing is pointless. Some people also use another technique, a smile. A gentle, calm smile during a refusal disarms the person. It shows that you're not angry or contemptuous, you're just being honest. People accept a refusal much more easily when it's said with a soft smile than when it's accompanied by irritation or a scowl. Stories from people confirm this. One woman said that she used to always agree to lend money to her friends. In the end, she found herself in debt and suffered from resentment. When she learned to say a short no with a light smile, many acquaintances were surprised at first, but soon they stopped asking because they felt her firmness. Her relationships with close friends weren't ruined. On the contrary, they became more honest and peaceful. Thus, the key to a good refusal is your internal state. When you are calm, confident, and respectful, your words sound different. Then a refusal becomes not a cold wall, but a clear boundary that protects both you and your relationships. In the next part, we'll talk about how to maintain a relationship after a refusal, what you can offer instead of money, and why sometimes a refusal can be the beginning of true trust. Once you've learned to say no calmly and confidently, a new question arises. How do you maintain the relationship after a refusal? Many people think that if you refuse someone, especially a close one, the connection will be ruined. But in reality, it's different. If you can hold your boundaries without aggression, relationships only become more honest. It's important to remember that true friendship or family ties cannot be based on endless loans. If your relationship is built only on the fact that you periodically lend money, it's not friendship or support. It's dependence. When you refuse, you test the strength of these bonds. A person who truly values you won't turn away because of money, and someone who disappears after your no was never truly there in the first place. One simple trick helps maintain the relationship. Offer another form of support instead of money. You can say, "I can't lend money, but I can offer advice," or "I don't lend money, but I can support you emotionally and listen." Sometimes you can offer help in finding a job, suggest where to find resources, or just share a conversation to help the person feel better. In this way, you show that you're not abandoning the person. You're simply maintaining your boundaries. There are cases when help without money is even more valuable. One young man was constantly asking his friends for loans, and most of them agreed. But one day, one of them said, "I can't give you money, but let me help you create a plan to get out of this situation." Instead of money, he gave him his attention and knowledge. A few months later, the man found a job and got out of debt. Since then, he respects that friend who refused, but helped in a different way. It's very important to maintain a respectful tone in communication after a refusal. You shouldn't act as if you've done something wrong. On the contrary, talk to the person calmly, continue the normal conversation. If you feel guilty and avoid contact, they will sense the tension. But if you behave naturally, the refusal will also be perceived naturally. There's another aspect. When you help everyone, you subtly begin to lose respect for yourself. You think you're kind and generous, but inside, fatigue and irritation accumulate. At some point, you start to get angry at the very people you were helping. And this ruins relationships much more than one honest refusal. It's a paradox. A refusal actually preserves friendship and respect because it protects you from internal burnout. Tibetan teachings often repeat, if a cup is filled for too long, the water will spill over and ruin everything. The same applies to a person. If you give more than you can, you lose both yourself and your connection with others. Therefore, boundaries are needed not only for protection, but also so that true generosity doesn't turn into resentment. Many people notice that after the first honest refusals, their lives become simpler. They stop being afraid that someone will constantly approach them with requests. People begin to respect their time and resources. And relationships with true friends become stronger because there are no longer any hidden expectations or manipulations. We can also recall another important detail. Sometimes we think that by refusing, we are taking away a person's hope. But in reality, we are giving them an opportunity to take responsibility for themselves. There have been cases when a person was used to living off others, as they were always lent money. But as soon as they heard a firm no, they found the strength within themselves, got a job, or started taking action. It turns out that a refusal is also a form of help, just a more mature one. The story of one family shows how this works. A son regularly asked his parents for money for small expenses. His parents, out of love, constantly gave it to him, although they lived modestly themselves. But one day the father said, "We can't give you any more money. If you want to achieve something, try to earn it yourself." At first, the son was offended, but over time, he got a part-time job and for the first time felt proud of his own work. The refusal became the beginning of his independence. Thus, you can maintain a relationship after a refusal if you act with respect and warmth. A refusal shouldn't be a cold wall. It can sound like a manifestation of care. The main thing is to stay calm, not to feel guilty, and not to cut off communication. Then your words will be perceived not as a rejection, but as honesty. In the next part, we'll summarize and explore why a refusal is also a manifestation of wisdom, how to get rid of the feeling of guilt, and how a simple practice can help you find inner strength and clarity. For many years, we've been taught to think that refusal is something bad. It seemed that if we said no, we were showing greed or indifference. But the deeper we delve into this issue, the clearer it becomes. The ability to refuse is a sign of maturity, wisdom, and inner strength. When you say no calmly, honestly, and without unnecessary justifications, you don't destroy relationships. On the contrary, you make them cleaner. You show that you're ready to be sincere, that you don't want to play the role of a savior or cash dispenser for everyone. And this position earns respect, even if the person is offended or upset in the moment. With time, they will understand that you are not an enemy, you are not closing the door, you are simply setting a boundary. The feeling of guilt that often arises after refusal is an illusion. It's based on childhood beliefs: be agreeable, share, don't refuse. But an adult lives by different rules. Their task is to preserve their resources, to use them wisely. If you give too much, if you live only for others' requests, you lose energy and self-respect. But if you maintain boundaries, you remain in balance. In Tibetan wisdom, it is often repeated: he who knows when to say no is always ready to say a sincere yes. This simple thought changes perception. If you can refuse, your agreement has value. You help when you truly can, not because you're afraid of offending. And this help becomes a true gift, not a forced sacrifice. It's also important to understand a refusal doesn't make you less generous. It just makes your generosity conscious. You can help others with advice, support, attention, time. Sometimes that's even more valuable than money. True generosity isn't about endlessly giving away resources, but about sharing from a place of fullness, not from a feeling of guilt. To make it easier to refuse and not feel inner tension, you can practice a simple exercise. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and remember a situation where you said no and it felt right. Feel the relief that came afterward. Realize that you preserved yourself and took an honest step. Hold that feeling inside. Now imagine that you're saying no again in a different situation. Briefly, calmly, confidently. Inhale, and on the exhale, say the word mentally. Repeat a few times. This small practice teaches you inner strength and removes the fear of refusal. Many people notice that after such exercises, the word no starts to sound natural. The tremor in their voice disappears, and the unnecessary anxiety goes away. Refusal stops being something scary. It becomes a part of life just as normal as agreeing. After all, both should come from a place of honesty. A refusal isn't coldness, it's a manifestation of care. Sometimes, by saying no, you give a person a chance to grow. Sometimes you save a relationship, sometimes you simply protect yourself from fatigue and burnout. But in any case, this word becomes a tool for clarity. Think about how many times in your life you've agreed, even though you felt resistance inside. How many times have you said yes when you wanted to say no? Every such moment left a heaviness inside. But once you honestly set a boundary, you'll feel lightness return. If you want your life to be harmonious, learn to be honest with yourself above all. If you don't want to lend money, don't. If you're not ready to reveal your finances, don't. You don't owe anyone an explanation. Your refusal is your right. In Tibetan teachings, there's an image. A wise person is like a tree that stands firm. The tree provides shade and coolness, but it doesn't agree to everything. It can't become a ladder, a bridge, or a bonfire for every person who passes by. It remains a tree, and that's its strength. Similarly, a person who knows their boundaries can be a pillar of support for others, while not losing themselves. So the ability to refuse a request to lend money without explaining your finances isn't just a social skill. It's part of an internal journey. It's the ability to be honest, to respect yourself and others, to preserve your energy, and to build relationships on truth. Every time you say no calmly and confidently, you become a little bit freer. You stop being a hostage to others' expectations and learn to be the master of your own life. And where there is freedom and honesty, there is respect and trust. May your words always come from clarity. May your no sound as sincere as your yes. And then every one of your answers will be a manifestation of wisdom. If these thoughts were helpful to you, share your experience in the comments and subscribe to the channel. This way, we can deepen our understanding of ourselves together and discover new facets of inner strength.